Hello, fourth grade, and welcome to day 5 of talking about fairy tales. Today we are going to talk about how in fairy tales characters often keep the same traits and seldom change. And hopefully this read to you the story of Snow White from the book of Brave Red, Smart Frog. We are going to be talking about that story in our lesson today. So our learning target is readers understand that characters in fairy tales often keep the same traits and seldom change. As a reminder, in fairy tales, what is a fairy tale? A fairy tale is a type of folk tale. Fairy tales often tell a story of good versus evil that involve magic and royal characters. So characteristics of fairy tales, a lot of times they begin with once upon a time, or they end with they lived happily ever after. A lot of times if they have something like that, you know it's about to be a fairy tale. They also take place in faraway places. There are characters who are royal, like kings and queens, and most fairy tales often have good characters as well as evil characters. Let's talk about why authors write fairy tales. Authors write fairy tales to entertain their readers. Fairy tales are classic stories that get told over and over again. When an author writes a fairy tale, they are adding their spin on a traditional story to entertain their readers. Okay, so today you read the story of Snow White. We are going to talk about different characters from Snow White, their traits, and we're going to question whether or not the character changed in the story. So, obviously, one of the characters in Snow White is Snow White herself. What were some of the traits that Snow White showed? I want you to take a minute to think about the traits of Snow White. Okay, and now I also want you to think about if the character changes. So does Snow White change throughout the story? Think about yes or no and why or why not. Now I want you to think about the new Queen January. Try to think of some traits that the new Queen January has. Think about it in your head. And now I want you to think, does that character change? Was there a change for the new queen? Why or why not? Snow White, some of the traits that you might have been thinking was that Snow White was hardworking. She was gentle, warm, bright, and kind. Did she change throughout the story? No, she stayed pretty constant. And then if we're talking about the new Queen January, she was cold, evil, selfish. She was jealous of Snow White. And did she change from the beginning to the end? No, she also did not change. She was still just as cold and evil and jealous and selfish from the beginning as she was in the end. Okay, so now we're also going to talk about Ye Shen and the Cinderella story from China. And I want you to think if Yan Shen, what Yan Shen's traits were. Think about that for a second in your head. And then I want you to think about if Yan Shen changed from the beginning to the end. Now I want you to think about the stepmother in this story. What are some of the traits of the stepmother? And I want you to think, did the stepmother change from the beginning of the story to the end of the story? Why or why not? Yan Shen, some of the traits you may have thought of, and it's okay if you were thinking of some slightly different ones, but Yan Shen was hardworking, she was lonely, and she was generous. Did the character change? No. Yan Shen was the same from the beginning as Yan Shen was at the end. And then think about the stepmother. Some of her traits were she was evil, selfish, and jealous. And did the character change? No. The stepmother was just as evil and selfish and jealous from the beginning of the story as she was at the end of the story. Okay, now it is time to go on to your independent reading. Make sure that you are independently reading the whole entire time and at the correct voice level that you should be at. Have a great day.